Hey, Crossroads, wanted to recap last week's sermon with you. We finished Christmas. We are talking about that first Christmas, and we've been looking at the stories of Joseph and Mary. And this week we looked at John's account of the Christmas story, and we titled the sermon The Reveal. And maybe you remember that show. It swept the nation, and I used it as an example. It was Extreme Makeover, the home edition. And the family would leave the house, and the crew would come in and they'd renovate that house. And then at the very end of the show, there was a bus blocking the viewpoint of what that house really looked like. And the family would yell with the crowd, "Move that bus." And it was an exciting time, an exciting show. We used that show to talk about how God kind of did that with Jesus. We want to know what God is like. We want to know who Jesus is. John reveals right here who Jesus is. He's more than just a baby in a manger. He's more than just a rabbi. He's more than a carpenter. He's more than a man. He is revealing who Jesus is in John chapter 1. And John has a way of writing right here where he has a style where he reveals who Jesus is, talks about the witness, talks about John the Baptist bearing witness to who Jesus is, and then he leaves us with a choice. And I just wanted to quickly recap those with you. We talked a lot in the sermon about what the Word meant, because John begins his gospel by saying, "In the beginning was the Word." And he equates Jesus to the Word. So if you want to deep dive into that, go back and watch the sermon itself. But John reveals Jesus as the Word, the Logos, the idea about God, the message of God, but he is also God himself. And in John chapter 1, starting in verse 2, he says, "He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." Now, John begins his whole book here with creation language. He's using language that is reminiscent of Genesis. And then even here, he's saying Jesus was there at creation. He created everything, and he equates Jesus to light coming into the world, just like when when Jesus created creation in the beginning, he said, "Let there be light." That was the first thing he said. And John is equating Jesus to the author of all creation, but not that Jesus points to creation, but rather that creation points to Jesus. This is the reveal of who Jesus is. He's not just a baby in a manger. He's not just a guy that died on a cross. He is the creator of the world. He is the creator of all things. And then he says that John bore witness about the light, that John pointed to the light and said, "Hey, this is the light." John said, "I'm not the light," but he pointed to the light. And then John gives us a choice. In verse 9, it says, "The true light, which gives light to everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own people, and his own people did not receive him." And here's the kicker, verse 12. "But to all who did receive him, all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but were born of the will of God." Again, this is kind of the creation story. And he's saying, look, people have this choice. Are they going to choose the light? Are they going to choose the good, the perfect that God has brought into the world? Or are they going to choose the chaos, the sin? And he says, if we choose the light, if we believe in his name, then we are children of God. That in and of itself is an amazing thing. But then John kind of repeats himself. He goes right back into revealing who Jesus is. In verse 14, it says, "The Word becomes flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory. Glory is of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, rather than creation talk right here, he starts using tabernacle talk. This is something that the Jews of the day would have fully understood. The way he equates Jesus, he says he becomes flesh and makes his tent among us, makes his abode among us. And this is the same way that they would talk about the tabernacle. And he's using that tabernacle talk to talk about how Jesus is the glory of God that they experienced way back in Exodus, where the pillar of fire would come and rest on the tabernacle, and that was where they could commune with God. It was that intersection of heaven and earth, and they could commune with God. He's saying Jesus is that glory. Jesus has come now and made his tent. Rather than man's tent being made to house God, now God's tent is coming and being housed among man. And so again, Jesus doesn't point to the tabernacle points to Jesus. This is a big revelation, a big reveal by John. Again, he's not just a baby, he's not just a man, he's not just a carpenter from Nazareth, he's not just a good teacher. He's saying this is God come down to the earth and made his tent, and we've seen his glory. Again, he says John testifies of this. John talks about the eternalness. John the Baptist testifies of this. And he's the one who has this eternal perspective and says, man, that I come to prepare the way for him, but he was before me. And then John talks about the choice again. In verse 16, he says, for from his fullness, and he talks about himself and probably the other apostles, we have all received grace upon grace. They chose the glory. They chose Jesus, and they have received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth come through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side, but Jesus has made him known. And so the big idea of John's Christmas story is so much more than the manger. It's so much more than the shepherds. It's so much more than Mary and Joseph and the wise men and Herod and all that. To John, John is saying, God has come. Not just a special anointed person, not just a prophet. This is God come in the flesh. God is revealed. He's kind of going, move that bus. And when the bus pulls away, what we thought was just a manger scene, what we thought was just a baby, what we thought was just a cool story that has turned into folklore of our day, John says, no, God is revealed, and it's glorious and it's powerful. And so I join with John the Apostle today and John the Baptist in bearing witness about this Jesus and saying, man, this is the one. This is the guy. Now we have a choice. We started the entire sermon on Sunday by quoting the very end of John's book. John gave us the purpose of his book. He said, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But he says, the things I have written here are so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And that's my challenge to us in this Christmas time. All of this was preached. All of this was given. This is why we come to church. This is why we live, so that we may know Jesus is the Christ. He is the God-man. He is the Word. God come in the flesh and dwelling among us, and that why we believe in his name, now we are children of God and we have new life in him. And I hope you're walking in that new life. If you're not, make Jesus the Lord of your life today. God bless you, church. We'll see you next Sunday. Can't wait for what God has for us in this coming year.